social media giant Meta announced that it's banning Russian media organizations from its social media platforms. The U.S.-based megacorporation said the action was being taken based upon allegations that the Russian outlets were using deceptive tactics to amplify Moscow's propaganda. The announcement seemed timed for release with the following statements from former Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton on a U.S. cable outlet Monday.
We are only at the beginning of understanding the whole iceberg here. What the Russians started doing in 2015 and 2016, what they continued doing, they've gotten more sophisticated. They aren't even pretending anymore. Their international news operation, Russia Today, RT, is an arm of the Russian government, an arm of its intelligence operation. It's basically an extension of their spying efforts. They are using Americans, both those who are witting and willing, and those who are unwitting and are just so surprised. They're getting, $400,000 a week or $100,000 a podcast to parrot Kremlin propaganda. And we know from what even Republicans have said, the chairs of the Intelligence Committee and the, Foreign Affairs Committee and other Republicans who are currently in office have said that Republicans go to the floor of the Congress and they parrot Russian talking points. So I think it's important to indict the Russians, just as Mueller indicted a lot of Russians who were engaged in direct election interference and boosting Trump back in 2016. But I also think there are Americans who are engaged in this kind of propaganda. And whether they should be civilly or even in some cases criminally charged is something that would be a better deterrence, because the Russians are unlikely, except in a very few cases, to ever stand trial in the United States. So I think we need to uncover all of the connections and make it very clear that you could vote however you want, but we are not going to let adversaries, whether it is Russia, China, Iran, or anybody else, basically try to influence Americans as to how we should vote in picking our leaders.
Clinton's statements came after Attorney General Merrick Garland obtained an indictment earlier this month accusing the Russian news outlet Russia Today of implementing, quote, a nearly $10 million scheme to publish and disseminate content deemed favorable to the Russian government, close quote. Garland's press statement said Moscow was creating millions of dollars worth of propaganda seeking to, quote, amplify domestic divisions in the United States, closed quote. With Meta banning RT from its platform at the apparent behest of the U.S. government, the news network spoke with another victim of U.S. corporate censorship, Dr. Seyed Mohammad Marandi, professor of international affairs from the University of Tehran in Iran.
Well, it was always like this, but in the past, when the United States was much more powerful, and so was the West, they tolerated some voices from the global South. And then as things began to change, their intolerance increased. They began really with Iran. All of Iranian media of any language has been banned from social media and or shadow. And many people who have been supporting Iran or Syria or Iraq or Yemen, they've all been removed from social media. I've had my Instagram and Facebook accounts removed many years ago. I don't have accounts on either. And many of my own students, they've had their accounts removed, and many because of fear that they would be removed, or that one day if they want to study abroad or go abroad, that they would get into trouble. They don't like or retweet or post anything linked to people like myself or RT or anything that is critical of the West. So there is a certain amount of, a large amount of self-censorship that comes alongside with these limitations. And as the West further declines, I think that intolerance is just going to increase more. The decoupling that they speak about with China, I think really includes everyone. And it's not just economics. It's going to be media as well. And as this happens, people in the United States are also becoming increasingly restricted. And in Europe, we've seen recently journalists like Richard Medhurst, who was arrested when he was entering his home country, the United Kingdom. He was arrested from the plane itself when it landed at, I think, Heathrow Airport. So, and activists, pro-Palestinian activists are being arrested. So the mood is changing in the West. It was never about freedom and democracy. It was because back then, because they were more powerful, they felt confident that they could tolerate some voices. But now that they decline, they become much less tolerant. And it goes even further. Before RT and other Russian outlets were removed, you can be absolutely certain that the algorithms were working against it. So social media companies are controlled by the United States. They are effectively arms of the state. And it's not really just Facebook or Instagram. X or Twitter, YouTube, all of them belong to factions within the state, within the United States. So obviously, none of them have any sympathy for freedom of speech that goes beyond what is acceptable to their interpretation of freedom of speech. And therefore, Russia is never going to be prioritized. Iran, Brazil, India, all of these countries will be punished, and their people will be punished when they say something or when they go too far in the eyes of the West, or when their narratives or where their truths are becoming problematic for the United States. They will be shut down, or they will be increasingly shadow banned. And that's why I think that countries in the global South have to think about social media. I think, for example, BRICS should, alongside presenting models or infrastructure to circumvent Western sanctions and financial institutions, they should also be, I think, thinking about creating an environment for their own social media platforms that are protected by member states, and which also accept the laws of each state within the environments of those states. They should create their own social media. Social media should not be controlled by the United States. If the United States wants to, if the regime in Washington wants to control X or Facebook, fine. But they shouldn't be allowed to prevent Iranians from saying what they want to say, the Russians from being able to speak to the world, the Chinese to be able to speak to their neighbors. That shouldn't be acceptable. So we have to seriously contemplate dealing with these issues, just as right now countries across the global South, and Iran and Russia in particular, because of the sanctions, are thinking about financial institutions, alternative means for trade and business, which don't use the dollar or Western banks. We should also be thinking about social media platforms that are independent of the West.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.